I mentioned already that marketing has a strong relationship with subjects like sociology, anthropology, and in particular psychology. If we want to be effective marketers, we need to understand our buyers' behavior. So when it comes to customers, marketers ask themselves core questions like this: who is important to us? As in, what audiences are we trying to target? Where do they buy? What locations? What are their choice criteria? As in, how do they come to those decisions? When do they buy? And how do they buy? If we can understand the correct answers to those questions, then we can more effectively deploy our marketing operations. Now, unfortunately, consumers are human, and humans are complicated. If they weren't complicated and the context and processes that are involved in making decisions around consumption were basic, then A, it wouldn't be difficult to convince people to buy our products and services, and B, there wouldn't be a reason for you to have to study marketing at university. Let's look at 5 specific psychological factors we want to understand about consumers and understanding how they behave: personality, perception, motives, beliefs and attitudes, and cognitive dissonance. Let's examine these one by one. So personality, first of all. When we study personality, we're examining the psychological characteristics that create consistent, lasting behavior in response to your environment. We usually refer to someone's personality by things like traits such as self-confidence, dominance, sociability, defensiveness, adaptability, and so on. Personality is extremely important because it allows us to build a profile of our customer. It allows us to really understand who they are and why they buy. You can use that profile to better understand how to tailor your products and services to that buyer, and then tailor your messaging to be as effective as possible when selling to that customer segment. Many marketers use the concept related to personality called self-concept. The main premise of self-concept is that a consumer's possessions directly contribute and directly reflect their identities, their how they view themselves in the world. And basically, a person is what they have according to this perspective. Therefore, marketers try to understand target customers by the things that they own and the things that they buy. So there's a circular relationship between the way in which marketers look to target us and the way in which we respond to that. The second thing, perception. How a consumer determines what they will buy is heavily influenced by their perception of the situation that they're in at any moment in time. So perception is the process by which consumers select, organize, and interpret information and environmental stimuli in order to form a more meaningful picture of the world around them. So one of the most massive forms of environmental stimuli is advertising, and I mentioned that we get exposed to thousands of advertisements every day at the start of this lecture. So it's physically impossible for our brains to actively pay attention to all of that stimuli. Add to that all the other stimuli that's in the environment, things like smells, tastes, sounds, other conversations, whatever. It's actually amazing that we are able to concentrate on anything at all, especially in this age of distraction with smartphones. So as a result, the brain controls what stimuli it will engage with. And through this process, we have our perception, what we actually perceive in the world. And consumers form their perceptions through the brain's processes of selective attention, selective distortion, and selective retention. So selective attention is a tendency for consumers to screen out some of the information that we're exposed to. So if we're marketers, then we're going to have to work very hard to actually get that attention, because the likelihood is that we get selected out. Selective distortion means that every consumer fits the stimuli that's coming in to their own mindset through their own kind of rose-tinted glasses, if you like. So we all distort what messages we get based on our own experiences, perspectives, personalities. So selective distortion is the tendency of people to interpret information in a way that will support what their worldview already is, or what they want to believe about a certain situation. Finally, selective retention means that consumers will usually forget much of the stimuli that they've been exposed to. So they will store information that best supports their existing attitudes and beliefs or preferences. So selective retention allows them to remember the good points they like and forget the things that don't really suit them. And for example, they might forget other brands that they don't already like, making it even more difficult to break through that perception barrier. These processes are what forces marketers to use so much repetition in advertising campaigns, because they're trying to get through. Motivation, or a motive, is a need that has become so sufficiently pressing that it directs us to seek satisfaction of that need. A consumer has a number of needs at any given time of their life. Humans are constantly being influenced by various biological and psychological motivations, but common biological needs arise from various states of tension, such as hunger, thirst, or some form of physical discomfort. Psychological needs will arise from a desire for social recognition, esteem, or belonging in familial, social, or political groups. Now, if one of these motivations becomes strong enough within the consumer, it becomes a need. And through various research, marketers have identified 5 categories of motivational needs, and it's often referred to as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So there's self-actualization, a customer's or consumer's self-development and realization. That's the highest form. Esteem, a consumer's sense of self-esteem, self-recognition, socio-economic status in the world. Social, consumer's sense of belonging and feeling loved in their environment. Satisfaction, a consumer's sense of security and level of protection in their environment. And fundamentally, physiological needs, a consumer's basic need for food, water, and shelter. The marketers have found that there needs to be a hierarchy of need satisfaction within the typical human being. So physical needs must be satisfied first. This is how this hierarchy of needs was formed by Maslow. Then a person is willing to seek satisfaction, fulfillment. Then a person will approach social needs. Then they'll pursue esteem. And finally, they'll look for self-actualization within their environment. The basic principle here is that a consumer will almost always try to satisfy the most pressing needs first above anything else. When that need is met, it will stop being a motivator and the consumer will move on, so to speak, to the next most influential motivator in that hierarchy. And marketers need to remember that motivated people are ready to buy, so they try to look to take advantage of understanding how we are motivated. But indeed, if we don't have security and shelter, and our hunger hasn't been satisfied, then we're not going to be interested in going for a spa retreat to relax as a self-actualization process. With beliefs and attitudes, through our daily activities, we build beliefs and attitudes that in turn influence our buying behavior, and these are constantly being developed and evolving. So consumers' beliefs are descriptive thoughts that they have about something, and attitudes would be understood as a consumer's relatively consistent evaluations, feelings, tendencies towards objects or ideas. So attitudes put people into specific frames of mind and help to move them towards or away from certain products or brands, and indeed certain kinds of behavior. And unfortunately, attitudes can be very difficult to change. Attitudes are a part of a consumer's learned behavior patterns, and psychologists understand that the majority of consumer behavior is learned behavior. Now, changing a consumer's attitudes and beliefs will usually require us to change many other perceptions and attitudes in other areas of the consumer's mind. So often it is easier to position a product into an existing attitude than to fight against them to try and change them. It's understood that one of the most difficult things to do is to educate a market on something new where they need to change their behavior, which is why sustainability and being environmentally conscious is something that is proving very difficult to engender within the wider consumer market. The marketers need to understand these beliefs and attitudes in order to best position their messaging in front of the target customer. So if we believe some of the target consumers' beliefs and attitudes are wrong about us, thereby preventing sales, then we can understand how to launch focused messaging campaigns to change beliefs about our products and brands, if of course we were the business who was trying to sell to the consumers. Finally, we have post-purchase dissonance, or cognitive dissonance as it's often called. That's a way to say basically after-sale discomfort. It's also the onset of buyer's remorse, as it's called. So post-purchase dissonance will begin once a consumer begins to, let's say, notice disadvantages or drawbacks of their purchase and begin to hear, let's say, good things about other products that they did not buy. So kind of alternatives that they could have bought when they purchased their product. To counter these feelings, marketers use after-sale communication campaigns with focused, targeted messaging. And these campaigns give encouragement to help support consumers and convince them to feel good about their brand choice. And that has the added advantage of also encouraging additional purchases or even referrals to friends. And these campaigns, this messaging often includes things like discounts and incentives for additional purchasing. So cognitive dissonance is really about regret, and the marketer's job is to make sure that after purchasing something, a consumer doesn't feel natural regret as a consequence of having committed to something. And the kind of behavior that we'll see from consumers depends on the context. I've mentioned before that context is always vitally important when considering consumer behavior. So you see here a matrix of different kinds of behavior that relate to different kinds of product categories. So along the left, you see situations where there are either a lot of differences between the brands on offer or few differences. And then along the top, the level of involvement the customer needs to have in the purchase process to make a decision. And we'll start with dissonance reducing, since we've just been talking about cognitive dissonance. So when the product is high involvement, but there is little discernible difference between different brands, a customer will make a decision based on trying to reduce the amount of cognitive dissonance they think they'll have at the other side of the purchase. So you take a good example, if you were redecorating your house and you were choosing a new paint. Now that's a process that's very involved because you need to do testing. It's an important thing because once the paint's on the wall, it's going to be there for a long time, so you need to get the decision right. But then the different brands of paint you see on the shelves of B&Q, for example, it's pretty difficult to get an idea of what distinguishes them other than the brand. So there's a really important role for marketing to play in that process, because the familiarity and the quality that someone feels coming from the brand will help them have a sense of reducing potential cognitive dissonance on the other side of a purchase. When you've got a high involvement product, just like we've been talking about with the paint, a high involvement product, but with significant difference between the brands, that's when you get a complex buyer behavior process. If you think of something like buying a car as a classic example in this category, because the customer needs to do a great deal of research and thinking about what they're going to do. It's involving a lot of their money, but there's a huge difference between one brand to the other. So if you're looking to buy a BMW versus a Ford, there are a great deal of differences in what the brands stand for, the kind of driver experience someone has, and so on. And so the process becomes complicated. There's significant amounts of perceived difference between the brands, and the level of involvement we're talking about refers to the actions the consumer must take in order to understand the product that they're going to buy. So high involvement is necessary because they need to learn, they need to research, they need to read reviews, they need to talk to others. I mean, in the car example, they also need to potentially take a test drive. So you see the amount of effort that needs to be invested by a customer in a complex decision. So we tend to see this, as I say, in high price purchases, something that's technologically complex as well. So buying a new laptop is another good example, because you've got a great deal of difference between, say, for example, buying a MacBook and a PC. So the amount of involvement increases. So the involvement process helps the consumer understand the difference between the brands and products they're motivated to buy, and then in turn this process is where the consumer develops a set of attitudes and beliefs towards their intended purchase. And these beliefs and attitudes, along with their motivations, which we discussed before, will influence heavily the decision. So there's a lot of effort that needs to be gone to by the marketing function of the business in order to try and achieve a sale when it's a complex purchasing process. When we've got few differences between the brands and low involvement, so the complete opposite of what we've just talked about, you get what's called habitual buyer behavior. And that refers to situations where a consumer has a low involvement in the purchase, in that they don't require to do a great deal of research to understand what it is that they're spending their money on. And there's lots of examples of product categories that would be habitual purchases, and they're usually everyday basic products, basic commodities. Classic ones, toilet paper. That's why there's lots of money spent on advertising of toilet paper, because the brands need to remind us that they exist. And also, because it's low involvement, because there's such few discernible differences between the brands, they need to keep reminding us that they're there. So they have to keep using advert repetition to build brand familiarity, and they need to get into our perception. They need to find their way into our awareness through means that we come across on a daily basis. And that's why things like advertising on television, on the radio, are effective ways for low involvement and low difference brands, so habitual purchase products. So anything like salt, pepper, butter, even things like milk and, as I've mentioned, toilet paper are classic habitual purchase examples. Finally, we've got variety seeking. So they're kind of similar in some ways because they tend to be common day goods, but consumers may have a few beliefs about certain things and a few attitudes built around these products. So things like, let's say, crisps. Everybody likes crisps. Most consumers will buy a particular brand with very little evaluation before the purchase. In fact, in product categories like crisps, evaluation tends to happen during consumption of the product. So beliefs and attitudes will come during the experience of eating them, or let's say using them at parties or whatever. And the next time the consumer is ready to buy, they'll sometimes buy the same brand if the experience was favourable, but they also might just decide at random to pick another brand purely out of boredom or to try something different. So all of this happens for the sake of trying something new, and negative beliefs or attitudes about a particular brand don't really enter into the decision-making process. So the marketing strategy might differ for the market leader versus competitors trying to grab a market share. Leaders will encourage habitual buying, dominating shelf space in supermarkets and keeping shelves stocked, running frequent reminder advertising. So you can see there's a slightly close relationship between the low involvement products in this space. So this is a model I like to call the sticky toffee pudding model because it's STP, segmentation, targeting, and positioning. This is the classic process that you follow in developing a marketing offering. So first of all, with segmentation, you're dividing a market into distinct groups with distinct needs, characteristics, or behaviors. So you're dividing them into smaller groups, and because buyers have different wants, desires, needs, geographic locations, economic resources, buying attitudes, and buying practices, we use this process to divide markets into different pieces. So you think of the whole orange as your total addressable market. You divide the orange into its segments. These are distinctive parts that make up the whole that you can target discreetly. But there's no standard way of doing segmentation. Marketers tend to use multiple combinations of variables in order to find the best way to view their target market. But there are typical kinds of variables that marketers will focus on. These major variables are geographic, so different world regions or countries, cities, different parts of geographical makeup. Second variable is demographics. That's age, gender, if it's a family unit, looking at things like family size, family life cycles to do with children growing up, leaving home, etc. Income levels, occupation, education levels, types of religion, race, different generations and different nationalities. The third variable is psychographic, and that would look at things like social class, lifestyles and personalities, so very psychological driven. Fourth is behavioral, which would include things like special occasions, benefits, attitudes towards user status, user ratings, loyalty status, purchase readiness stage, and attitudes towards and beliefs towards products and brands. So there's loads of variables available to marketers for the purposes of segmentation. And you could say, well, just pick one or two, but marketers tend to use a complex mixture of different variables in order to build segmentation. And any one business that presents its segments to you will not use the same process, because the process will be very context specific and very specific to a business's own capabilities. But these are the basic broad categories of variables that are used. All segments, though, have to be measurable. They have to be accessible, so you actually have to be able to reach the people that belong to your segment. They have to be substantial enough that when they are targeted, they yield profitability. They have to be differentiable from one another, so you don't want to build segments that are easily confused. They have to be distinctive. And they have to be actionable. Now, in today's modern digital world, we have so much access to data that segmentation has become a very sophisticated process. And indeed, the power of machine learning and artificial intelligence allows us to build much narrower, more distinct segments than has ever before been possible. So it's an ever-growing and increasingly important part of marketing. Targeting is the process of evaluating each market segment's attractiveness and selecting one or more segments to enter. It's generally conducted at 4 distinct levels, and these are based on the relative size of the targeted segments. So from largest to smallest, you start with undifferentiated mass marketing, then you get differentiated segmented marketing, then you get concentrated niche marketing, then you get micro marketing at a local or individual level. So undifferentiated mass marketing is a marketing strategy where a company chooses to ignore segment differences. So their data would have told them differences between different segments, and they just go to the whole addressable market with one distinct product offering. And this type of strategy focuses on most common needs of consumers rather than what is distinctly different about them. And this was a classic strategy in the sort of early days of the contemporary marketing style, the 1950s and so on, with the goal of appealing to the largest group of buyers possible in order to create as many sales as possible. This is the classic volume tactic. Product margins are low because you're basically trying to get the lowest possible price, the highest possible turnover, and gain your profitability through scale. And the value given to the customer is really marginal as well. So modern marketers do not tend to believe in this strategy. It's quite difficult to successfully roll out a mass market campaign. Differentiated targeted marketing is more common. That's where we select several market segments, design focused products and marketing mixes for each segment with the goal of higher sales and a relatively stronger position within each individual segment. So the advantage of this is that it typically gives a company higher sales across the segment, but the increased sales tend to bring with them increased costs because you're differentiating across different markets. Basically what you're doing is you're developing and producing 10 units of 10 different products packaged in different ways potentially to different potential buyers rather than 100 units of one individual product. So it costs more to market, it costs more to package, and so on, but the relative yield is higher. Then you've got concentrated marketing. That's a strategy where a firm will choose to pursue a distinctive large share of a distinctive individual segment or a very narrow range of segments that have commonalities between them. So concentrated marketing allows a company to achieve stronger market position in those segments. It allows them to gather greater knowledge of the consumers within that segment and then fine tune towards selling towards them. That's something that you'll see often in smaller companies, market entry, companies that have much shorter on resources to do broader strategies of targeting. And finally, micro-marketing is a strategy where companies will tailor their products and their marketing mixes to the needs and wants of very specific individuals or local consumer groups. So micro-marketing generally involves consumers in the kind of luxury end of the market, and it can give consumers great value because of their involvement, and it can give the companies extraordinary value and customer equity in return because the company is getting a great deal of insight into the behaviors, attitudes, interests of their target market, and that level of feeling special and involved in the process generates a huge amount of value for the customers. Now, once you've evaluated and chosen your segment to target and worked out your targeting strategy, you've got to work on differentiation. And that is differentiating the marketing offering and creating a sense of superior value to your target market. So that's all about positioning in the market. Where in your consumer group, your targeted customer segments heads does your brand belong, and how does that communicate value? So what you've got written there, arranging for a product to occupy a clear, distinctive and desirable place relative to the competing products in the minds of targeted consumers. You can make sense of a brand's positioning by using a positioning map. So in new product development, a business would use this to look at where they want to position themselves relative to the competitors in their market space. So they'll present how consumers perceive a brand or a product or a service in relation to competitors. So there are typically two axes. Each axis represents a specific and important attribute for the brand. So if you're a marketer for a brand, you would use either proprietary data from your own customer base or access secondary data to accurately inform the positions you place your competitors on the map. And that then allows you to consider where your brand belongs on the map, and then think about what strategies need to be implemented if you want to reposition your brand, for example, if you're going through a process of change. But indeed, what strategies need to be used in order to successfully sell to your customers. So what you see on the map here is a visual of different higher end fashion brands. You can see that there's considerable saturation clustered in the prestige exclusive space. But Gucci, for example, commands a dominant position in a mass market prestige brand. And Gucci has diversified its heritage as a luxury brand to increase its revenue by repositioning itself as a more accessible luxury brand in recent years. So you see how it's got a sense of dominance in that space on this particular map. And this represents the process of positioning that would follow your segmentation and targeting strategies. When I mentioned market segments earlier, I talked about the whole orange and then the orange segments, the whole orange being the total addressable market. What you've got to remember with that is the marketing mix must reflect the size of the total addressable market for any individual segment. So if you take this example here, you've got the market for digital cameras. You've got the whole mass market, which will be interested in the basic lower priced point and shoot. And then you start to get different market segments that are smaller, that has specific needs. So you've got on the left the market segment that is interested in a compact portable size, and then on the right you've got the market segment that's interested in having better quality photos from the machine. You can then start to add in market niches. So you've got on the right hand side that market segment that had an interest in higher quality photos. Then you've got the niche within that which are interested in professional level photography. Now the price of the products will be reflective of the size of the market segment. So it's not just about how much does it cost to make a professional spec camera, but the size of the market is smaller and more exclusive and has a greater desire to engage with the product. So that price is reflective of multiple things in the process, the marketing mix reflecting the nature of the market segment. And then here's an example of micro market niche where you've got the amount of people interested in a waterproof camera so small. So the price is going to be proportionately far higher for that product than is the cost of production.